Oh, g'day mate. Come on in. Fancy a cuppa? Alright, today guys, we're going to go through the expression fancy a cuppa in Australian English. This is an Australian slang term that is used all the time in Australian English, especially with the older generation. The younger generation might not use this as much, but maybe the older I get, the more I'll start using it. Anyway, I love this expression. Let's get into it. So, the expression is fancy a cuppa. Fancy a cuppa. Let's break this down. Fancy here, if you fancy something, it is that you desire that thing, you like that thing, you want that thing. If you fancy going to the beach, you want to go to the beach. If you fancy eating a pizza, you want to eat a pizza. Maybe you fancy sitting down, you want to sit down. You desire the thing, you like the thing, you want the thing, okay? To fancy something. We often use this in Australian English. Would you fancy going to the movies, right? Do you fancy something to eat? Do you fancy lunch? Do you fancy hanging out with my dad? I don't know, do you fancy that? A cuppa. Now, a cuppa, as I'm sure many of you know, this is a slang term that is a contraction of a cup of tea or a cup of coffee. What we've done is we've removed the word tea or coffee and we've just turned it into a cup of, a cuppa, a cuppa. So, I think you now know what the expression fancy a cuppa means. It's a question asking if someone desires, if they want, if they would like a cup of tea or a cup of coffee, right? Fancy a cuppa? Come on in, mate. Fancy a cuppa? I'll chuck the kettle on and I'll pour you a cuppa. So this is a big part of Australian culture. If you come to Australia and you travel around the place and you meet people, they invite you into their house, they might offer you a cup of tea, and this phrase is going to be heard all over the place, all over the shop. They're going to say fancy a cuppa. A response to this might be, yeah, I'd love a cuppa. In fact, I'll have a cup of tea. They'll often verify, fancy a cuppa? Yes. Tea or coffee? I'll have coffee. I'll have tea, okay? I fancy a cuppa. I fancy a cup of coffee, cup of tea, okay? Now, to talk about this, I thought I would mention that the older generation tends to use this. My grandparents would use this probably more than my parents, although my parents don't drink tea or coffee, so that's probably a big reason they don't use it. Not because of their age. And I wanted to mention too some of these familiar words that are used by Australians in informal situations when referring to people one-on-one. So they might say something like, fancy a cuppa dal. So fancy a cuppa dal, which is short for darling, right? It's an endearment term, a term of endearment, usually used by women, okay? Another one by women might be love. Fancy a cuppa, love? And again, these are used by these older women on people of their age, but also younger people. So if you went to someone's house, they might say to you, fancy a cuppa, love? Fancy a cuppa, dal? Do you want a cuppa? Now, if you're a man, you might say mate. Fancy a cuppa, mate? Do you fancy a cuppa? Would you like a cup of tea or a cup of coffee? Fancy a cuppa, mate? Okay, so if you're a girl, if you're a woman, in the older generation, you might say love or dal. If you're a man, you might say mate. Okay, fancy a cuppa. Fancy a cuppa, mate? Now, before we finish up, guys, I thought we could talk a little bit about pronunciation. So I want to go through the phrases, would you fancy a cuppa? And do you fancy a cuppa? But I want to talk about how these phrases change the faster we speak. So this is connected speech, and specifically it's called assimilation, where you have two sounds joining together, or at least one after the other, where those sounds join to become a different sound. So have a listen to these two phrases and see if you can hear the change in sound when I say them one after the other, okay? Would you fancy a cuppa? 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 Do you fancy a cuppa? Do you fancy a cuppa? Do you fancy a cuppa? "Do you fancy a cuppa?" Great work, guys. Hopefully that helps you now understand when Aussies or other English speakers are speaking really quickly using connected speech and assimilating words or sounds like that. And hopefully you can use them too to sound more natural when you yourself are speaking English. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this episode, guys, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Peace.